The Rebel Capitalist Show, episode 19. All right, guys, it gives me a great deal of pleasure to bring someone to the Rebel Capitalist Show that I have a tremendous amount of respect for. He's someone that I've been following a long time. He is definitely one of my favorites in macroeconomics and finance. His name is Jeff Snider, and he is with Alhambra Investments. Jeff, thanks for being on the Rebel Capitalist Show.
Thank you, George. Pleasure to be here. If you want to start with the Bank of England paper, it's not a bad place to start. I don't agree with much of but it does get one thing right, which I think is the key thing, is that money is created by banks. And that's really the only thing we need to start with as far as that's concerned. I get that right.
Well, I'm actually glad to hear you say that, Jeff, because I've been racking my brain over that report literally for a month. Seriously, for a month, every single weekend, probably 8 hours a weekend, trying to figure it out. And there's so many discrepancies where they contradict themselves within that report. Sometimes they say that they supply the reserves on demand. And then in other places, they say that those reserves go with the deposit. And therefore, the bank can get low on reserves, which would actually restrict the amount of lending or money creation that they can do. But it's every single page they say something different. And I thought, am I just stupid? Am I not following this? Or is this report written wrong? So it's great to hear you say that there's some errors there.
Well, you know what it is, George? It's the fact that these are people who have been steeped in the orthodox of monetary scholarship, which is very thin to begin with, and it's been thin for decades now. And so they're coming at this from the perspective of inside the system, inside the central bank. And from inside the central bank, they cannot imagine how the actual system works because they're so far down into the minutia, they can't see the big picture. And I run across this all the time with people who work in the banking system. They can't really figure out what is it. The system doesn't seem to work the way everybody says it does. Yet, I can't figure out how it actually does work.
Yeah, because all they can see is their balance sheet.
Right, and not even the balance sheet. Most people in the banking system, including the central bankers, they have a very narrow task. Like they have a very narrow mandate. Somebody working in the banking system might only have, they work on a specific desk and they have a very limited visibility because they're only doing one thing. They're trading interest rate swaps. They don't know what those are for or why they're doing it. They're just trying to make as much money as they can on interest rate swaps. And the same thing in a central bank capacity too. A lot of the staff economists, first of all, they come at it from the orthodox perspective, but even those that say at Federal Reserve Bank of New York, who might be into the weeds, so to speak, they're coming at it from a very narrow perspective where they can't really put all the pieces together. So I think that's symptomatic of what you see in the Bank of England report is we know money isn't the way it's taught in the economics textbook. We really don't know what it is either. We can't really come at the situation any better, except for this one thing that we say in this report is that money is not created by central banks. It's created by the banking system. Milton Friedman and others said a long time ago, money creation is done by the bookkeeper's pen. And the bookkeeper is a banker. So that's what, if anybody reads the Bank of England report or any of those like it, the key takeaway from it is that money is a bank creation. It's a credit-based monetary system. And that opens up the door to all this other stuff.
And is that just in the retail side of it? So in what I would call the difference between the real economy and the financial economy, or can the Fed print money or create money and then spend it into deposits into the retail banking system by buying treasuries or assets that are actually held in the private sector?
Well, what the Fed does is it creates bank reserves, which sounds like it should be money, right? I mean, bank reserves, that historically bank reserves for money. And I think, George, maybe it'll help if we go through a simple example of what I'm talking about in terms of money creation in a credit-based system. Hey, let's pretend I'm a bank. Let's pretend you're a bank in Medellin. I'm in Florida. So we're in Florida. I actually happen to have a $5 bill, which is a Federal Reserve note. It's a physical currency. It's not actual money because we don't use money anymore. We only use currency. So this is U.S. currency. You say to me, hey, Jeff, I need that $5, right, for whatever reason. You're in Florida. I'm in Colombia. All we need to do is, okay, I just gave you the $5. What happens is I'm a bank in Florida. You're a bank outside the United States. You write down on your assets and liabilities that you got $5 from me. It's a computerized transaction. It's a ledger transaction. This $5 bill never goes anywhere. It stays with me in my pocket or my vault, so to speak. But what we've done is, I've created a $5 asset, which is an interbank loan to you. I have an offsetting liability. You've created you now have a $5 liability to me that goes on your books, and an offsetting asset, which is cash and cash equivalents. So we've actually doubled the money supply from $5 to $10 through nothing more than electronic transmission. This $5 currency stays with me. It doesn't go anywhere. Now, if you were a bank, say in Chicago, and we did the same transaction, there would be a reserve requirement where I would actually, if the reserve requirement was 8% like it used to be, I'd have to send you 40 cents at least. We couldn't just say that we spent $5. I'd have to send you 40 cents. And then you wouldn't be able to do the transaction until you got the 40 cents because you'd have to have some liquid currency in reserves. So the fact that you're offshore, and this is why I talk about the offshore system so much, is there's no reserve requirement. It's a reserveless system. So the very fact that you and I say, hey, I have this $5 bill, but I on my books, I gave it to you. I lent it to you. There's no reserve requirement. You can then say, Jeff, you're a bank in the United States. You're good for the $5. I now have that $5 on my books too. Now here's the real thing. Now that the $5 is floating around on your books, you can do all sorts of things with it. You have $5 in cash and cash equivalents. Now you have an offsetting liability, which is an interbank loan to me. But as far as anybody knows, you're a bank, I'm a bank. You have that $5. So you can go to somebody else who says, you know what? I know a guy who wants to invest in a factory in Singapore. He needs dollars because the world needs dollars. The dollar is the reserve currency, and the dollars are the way these things get done. What you can say is, I've got $5. I just got $5 from this guy from this bank in Florida. We went through the interbank market, this wholesale interbank market. He has $5. Now I have $5, and guess what? I'll lend it to you. So now we all have $5.
In dollars.
Right, $5. We all
US
have $5. Right, and there's only the one single currency. This is the only one that's out there. But yet, because we're in this offshore space where it's a reserveless system, as long as you're willing to create a liability and an offsetting asset, and I'm willing to do the same thing, and the guy that you're doing business with that wants to go to Singapore does the same thing, we're all creating money out of thin air. It's the bookkeeper's pen.
Right. And if the bank that first had the $5 in the United States, let's say the Medellin Bank, and if there's no reserve requirements, is there anything that would limit them or prevent them from lending out more than that $5?
Theoretically, it's unlimited, right? Because I mean, you could just lend and lend and lend. But
that's what I thought.
We live in the real world. Even if we go offshore, which is why the offshore system got so big, the regulations aren't what they are onshore. However, there are still constraints. You have to think about how a bank puts together its balance sheet. I'm gonna be concerned about risk. George, if I think you're a risky bank, maybe I don't want to lend to you. Or if I'm concerned about, if this $5 has to go someplace else, I have my own balance sheet constraints that they always pertain to the basics of finance, which are risk versus return. So when I lend you that $5 in the interbank market, I expect to get paid from it. You're going to send me some interest. And if that interest is good enough and the risk is low enough, then we'll create that money.
But if they miscalculated risk, like in the forms of the mortgage-backed securities before 2007, then they create all this money thinking that it's almost risk-free, when in reality, there was a tremendous amount of risk there.
Right, which they never appreciated because up until that point, it had, recency bias and confirmation bias. Nothing bad had happened, so nothing bad could ever happen. That was the thought. And by the way, if we do run into trouble, Ben Bernanke's there. The Federal Reserve will bail us all out because that's what we've been taught since we were kids in school.
Right.
And that we found out that wasn't true either. And the reason why, or a key reason why the Fed doesn't matter as much as people say is, in that transaction between you and me, I create an asset. I have a $5 asset that's an interbank loan to you. But what is the liability I record? Well, the Bank of England paper and traditional economics says it's a deposit. But it doesn't have to be a deposit. It could be a currency swap. It could be any form of derivative. We can be very creative in how we fund this transaction between you and me. And you can be just as creative how you fund the transaction between you and the other guy. And then he gets creative. And so we have all of these derivatives at play that don't function the same way as a depository system would. It gets utterly complicated. It gets very, very hard to untangle, especially when we're trading liabilities back and forth. And none of these things really conform to the traditional basic ideas of what is money. It's not this. It's bank liabilities of all kinds.
And I want to make sure that everyone's following us here. When you say liabilities, that could be, or most of the time, that's considered a deposit, because the deposits are a liability for the bank. So I think as the average person listens to you, they hear liability, they think of their balance sheet, where a liability is actually like a mortgage that they have, and an asset would be the deposit. But when you're talking about it from the bank's balance sheet, from their standpoint, those deposits are liabilities. And to your point, some sort of maybe derivative, or who knows what else could be on that side of the balance sheet along with those deposits.
Yeah, George, that's a good point. I'm glad you're pointing it out, because from the bank perspective, everything's reversed, right?
Right.
Because the mortgage is an asset for the bank. So any kind of loan is an asset, any kind of claim on somebody else. So what I would, that $5 loan between you and me, for me, is an asset because I've lent you $5. I have a $5 claim on you. It's an interbank loan, and I have to create an offsetting liability, which is for a bank, it's the funding side. And traditionally, you're right. If everybody's taught the traditional money multiplier of fractional reserve banking, right? You take in some cash and then you multiply out into loans and then offsetting deposits. But what we're talking about is very different from that.
Right.
And so, you're right to point out that for me, a liability is just the funding side. What is the funding side of the asset side?
Yeah, and the main reason it's different, if I'm hearing you right, is because there's no reserve requirement. That is the key.
That's one of the keys. The others, there's others, but that's how we get from the traditional notion of fractional reserve depository lending into this modern commercial banking wholesale system, which operates very differently. Very different rules, very different methods, very different conventions. In reserves, it's a reserveless system, because in the truth, nobody wants the currency. Who wants to trade $5 bills back and forth? It's much easier for us to just computerize our transactions and just put numbers on a computer screen.
Yeah, just like a scoreboard at an NBA game or something.
Yeah, exactly. That's all it is. As long as your numbers on your computer match my numbers on my computer, everything is good. Yeah. When they start to not match, that's when things start to go awry. And then you start asking, in a reserveless system, where do you go? Where do you go for recourse? You're supposed to be able to go to the Fed, but if we have a currency swap arrangement, we have some derivative transaction between us, what good is QE and what the Fed can do? I can't go to the discount window. So, it's a very different way of doing money, and it's incredibly complex, and it spans the entire globe, because we're really talking about what the dollar system is, the world's reserve currency. And so these dollars, these fake virtual dollars, I call them Eurodollars because the term Eurodollar means offshore dollars. It has nothing to do with the European currency. Right. Eurodollar means offshore dollars. And all of these offshore dollars, and there are trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions. In fact, nobody knows how many there are because it's all between banks. And so these trillions of dollars that operate between banks offshore, everybody around the world needs them. The global economy runs on these Eurodollars.